So we're going to begin our look now at modern or generative linguistics. This is the approach that has dominated since about 1957. Its treatment is largely mathematical and formal, and at its heart is that particular subfield called syntax, which we'll get to in a minute. And this is what is most intimately connected with the work of Noam Chomsky, shown there on the right, who we've met before. And this work, of course, has occurred at the same time and in collaboration with innovations in the development of cognitive psychology, the whole emergence of information processing and computation as a paradigm after the end of the Second World War. I mentioned before that there are 6 fields that we're going to walk through, and that 2 of them, pragmatics and phonetics, were not really part of the generative tradition. What I mean by that is, as we go through these fields, we'll start addressing questions of meaning, and we'll see that meaning means something different within the field of pragmatics than it does in semantics. And pragmatics is still very much rooted in the complexities, non-systematicity of the real world. But then we'll move into much more formal, abstract ways of treating of meaning with semantics, then syntax, which deals with word order, morphology with word composition, phonology with the sequencing of sounds. In an abstract sense, that's the generative domain. That's also where structuralist linguistics focused. And then we'll drop back out again into the real world. Phonetics is also concerned with sound, but it doesn't have the same systematic commitments as the generative approach. So pragmatics and phonetics lead us in from meaning on one side to sound on the other side, and then the 4 subfields in the middle represent the generative tradition. So we're going to start with meaning. Now, attempts to formalize meaning have had mixed success at best. In certain contexts, for example, in the wonderful world of computers, text processing, natural language processing, and so on, formal approaches have made great advances. In the philosophy of language, which is a huge field, perhaps the major figure in the 20th century was Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose work consisted of 2 halves. In the first half, he tried to establish a formal theory of meaning, and in the second half, he gave up. And the sort of maxim you might take from the second half of Wittgenstein is that the way to understand how meaning works, or what meaning is in language, is inextricably tied to the situation, the complex, embedded, embodied situation in which language is used. Language here is nothing other than patterns of usage. Wittgenstein's approach then leads us into pragmatics, which is a broad field looking at the context in which language is used. So this is not an abstract formal theory. It's trying to figure out how the words spoken relate to the intention of the speaker and to the understanding of the hearer. How do the words relate to the intentions? That this is not simply a matter of mapping from words to world is clear when we approach a sentence with the slightly problematic notion of literal meaning. If someone asks you, "Can you pass the salt?" a perverse literalist reading of that might be to understand it as an inquiry into your capacities. And you might answer, "Yes," and not pass the salt. And that would be very annoying. Language doesn't work in a strictly literal fashion. And the words that someone say don't explain the speaker's intentions, but we are members of a linguistic community, and we nevertheless navigate these waters understanding people's intentions very, very well. So a philosopher called Grice was very helpful here in observing that when we converse, if we chat to each other, this is fundamentally a cooperative exercise. We are cooperating, even if we're having an argument. There are certain unspoken norms that guide that cooperation. He called these maxims, conversational maxims, and a maxim is not a rule, It's a norm. And norms, as we know, can be broken. So anytime two people are speaking, whether they're friends or enemies, nevertheless, their conversation is structured by these norms, which are understood by both to shape all conversation at all times. And these norms relate to things like when to speak, how often to speak, how much information to provide. Let's look at a few of Grice's conversational maxims. In matters of truth, for example, there is an unspoken agreement among conversational participants that they are going to be truthful. Obviously, you can say something which you believe to be false. But if you do that in the context of a conversation and the person you're talking to realizes that you did it, the whole conversation is changed. So there's up to the point where such a realization appears, we have a normal conversation. When a maxim is violated, then the conversation changes. Likewise, it's understood in every conversation that you won't make claims for which you don't have any evidence. You won't introduce complete fabrications. And obviously you can do that, but if you do that and I notice you doing that, then it's a very, very different conversation. So those two maxims relate to how truthful you are. Then there's how much you say. You're all familiar with the concept of too much information, for example. In a conversation that goes well, people will provide as much information as is required for the purposes of the conversation and no more. They won't withhold relevant information and they won't flood the zone with irrelevant information. So those maxims of quantity, like the maxims of truth, they can be broken, violated, but if they do, that changes the conversation. That's meaningful in itself. Be relevant is a standard sort of framing assumption of participants in a conversation. If someone consistently introduces irrelevant material, it's not much of a conversation. So once again, the maxim can be broken, but the breaking of the maxim influences the meaning that is generated by the conversational activity. There are maxims of clarity as well. Avoid obscurity of expression, avoid ambiguity, be brief and be orderly. These are like good manners, aren't they? You can obviously break any of these, and you might choose to do so for stylistic purposes. That's absolutely fine. But if you do so, you're layering new layers of meaning on the conversation. If I stick in random Latin quotes, suddenly the conversation is changed. If I don't shut up, or if I'm totally all over the place with my thoughts, that influences the meaning that is available in the conversation in a way that you wouldn't get at simply by looking at the words. You have to look, in other words, at the expectations of those taking part, their joint understanding of what's going on, and the context in which the conversation occurs. So all conversations have this in the background. There's always some unstated rules, not rules, maxims, guidelines, norms, which hold in most cases, in most conversations, and which, when violated, change the nature of the conversation. That's the messy business of pragmatics. We've only scratched the surface, of course. But as you can see, there's a lot of common sense in here, and there's not much in the way of formal, logical, mathematical thinking at all. Meaning is not a single theme. Meaning, this is obviously about meaning. Pragmatics is about language use in context, the meaning that is generated through conversational activity. We're now going to cross the border into the rarefied abstract world of generative linguistics, where there is also a field connected with meaning, and it's very different. This is semantics. Semantics claims to study meaning, but it interprets that word meaning in a very precise sense. Semantics is never concerned with this conversation or that conversation, with these conversational participants in that context. Here, semantics abstracts away from all context and asks about the meaning of an abstract notion like a sentence. So here are two sentences, for example. All Dubliners are not dumb, and not all Dubliners are dumb. I've put them there as examples for use in a lecture. Nobody actually uttered these. These are not claims made by somebody. So there's no conversational maxims to be violated. We've now got to the point where we're treating sentences as abstract things, untied to the context in which they're produced, and irrespective of the manner in which they are produced. So the logical relation between those two sentences is the same whether those sentences are written down or spoken. Let's have a look at them. All Dubliners are not dumb. Let's assume that's true. Or let's assume I argue it. And then you go out and you bring me a dumb Dubliner. Oh, well, now my sentence is false. But consider the second one. If I assert, not all Dubliners are dumb. You can go out there and find me a dumb Dubliner. It doesn't make my sentence false. You would have to demonstrate to me that there's no non-dumb Dubliners in order to falsify that. So the conditions of falsification are very different for those two sentences, despite their very close similarity. This is the way semantics treats of meaning here at the sentence level. You can treat of individual words in this fashion, abstracted from any sentence in which they occur in, let alone any context in which people use the words. So consider the words student and pupil. Do they mean the same thing? Well, there's many ways to approach this. One way is to look at where we use them. If we're talking about primary school kids, we would refer to them as pupils. If we're talking about university students, we refer to them as students. We don't refer to them as pupils. In secondary school, it's not so clear, is it? There's a sort of a transition zone. So there's overlap between these two, but they're not quite coextensive. Each of them can be used for populations where the other would be inappropriate, but there's also cases where they are interchangeable, more or less. So those kinds of properties of these words have been abstracted out of any specific concrete utterances. This kind of analytical framework is a logical way of thinking, and semantics employs all the tools of formal logic. To give you an example of how this works when we view language as a system, for example, we'll find many words that have particular kinds of semantic relations. So, for example, we notice that student and pupil have partially overlapping, but not completely overlapping senses. We can occasionally, very occasionally, find two words whose overlap seems to be complete. So sofa and couch seem to me to mean the same thing. They are synonyms. They have the same meaning. I cannot think of a case where you would use sofa and it would not also be just as fine to call it a couch and vice versa. Most words, this is quite rare to find such complete overlap. And just as two words can have the same meaning, two words can have opposite meanings. Not every word has an opposite. The opposite of lamp, the opposite of apple, they don't have opposites. But up has an opposite, which is down. In has an opposite, which is out. So antonyms are words of opposite meaning, and there's selected words that have that particular semantic property. Then there are words which have multiple meanings, and semantics would choose to point out that there are many ways in which you can have multiple meanings. So the word chip, for example, can be used for the wafer inside your computer where the CPU is housed. That's a silicon chip. And it can be used for the fatty piece of potato that you get in the chipper. Those meanings are not unrelated, though. They both come from a core sense of striking or cutting a flake or a small piece off a larger thing. So you chop up a potato to make chips. You chop up a silicon block to make computer chips. So that's an example of polysemy, which means one core meaning but articulated in various ways. There's another way in which a word can have multiple meanings, and that is without a common core underlying it. So a bank is a place where you store your money, and a bank is a word used to refer to the side of the river. And if we look back in time, we find those are completely different senses. They have different origins. There's no overlap there. So there's no core of meaning in the bank as an institution that transfers to the core of meaning of the side of a river. So this is sort of an accidental coincidence. We call these homonyms. So they're using the same name even though they mean and refer to completely different aspects of the world. Words reveal the structures of our categories as well. So we have many words that describes classes of things. So for example, furniture is a high-level category that can be used to describe tables and chairs and presses and so on. In the mathematical domain, a polygon is a shape with multiple sides, and there are many kinds of polygons. So a triangle is a polygon with 3 sides, and a square is a polygon with 4 sides. Here the relationship is one of inclusion, so triangle is included as a special case of polygon. We say it is a hyponym, that means below, hyponym, and whenever you see hypo, there's going to be hyper, so polygon is a hypernym of triangle. You get the idea. These are logical relations expressed in this abstract domain of semantics. In the next video, we'll move on to syntax.